It was a warm evening, and we were eating outside on Nanny Faye and Papa Ben's rarely used patio. We gathered at Nanny and Papa's, my maternal grandparents' home, for Thanksgiving, the high holidays, and Passover. But this was spring or summer, a break from our usual routine. Perhaps it was Memorial Day in the early 1970s, or just a Sunday when Papa was around, not working, a rare event. And so we sat at a long table above the sloping backyard that led down to Great Aunt Lil and Great Uncle Jack's house just beyond the hedge. Maybe this was the time between Uncle Jerry's two marriages, after he split with his first deaf wife, my Aunt Rhonda, and before he got together with a hearing woman named Brenda, who would go on to become his second wife. There was a scent of cooking meat, along with the novelty of eating outside at my grandparents'. And there was Papa's voice, rising in frustration as he lectured Jerry at the far end of the table. Papa's rasp, seasoned by an endless chain of camel filters held between slim tapered fingers, built into the, "How many times have I told you? I've explained all this before," mantra he often used with Jerry, as if his rage could penetrate my uncle's deaf ears. It wasn't until years later, after I taught deaf children myself, that I realized Jerry faced a difficult task. Papa wore a mustache, which made lip reading almost impossible. When Papa spoke to me, it was with warmth and affection. Yet with Jerry, it was the oral equivalent of his sandpaper-like cheeks, the roughness I felt when I kissed him. At dinner, Papa berated Jerry about being responsible. I tuned out the specifics, consumed with my own problems. As Papa spoke, the volume rose with that familiar refrain, and a vein pulsed in his forehead as if he might combust at any moment. Jerry, who towered over his father, 6'3" to Papa's 5'8", shrunk into himself and went pale. I didn't want to watch, to see this physical, powerful man becoming small. It hit too close to home, reminded me of myself, a bullied boy who at 16 stood 5'4" and weighed 100 pounds. It was because of Jerry, my only uncle, and Aunt Rhonda that I grew up knowing that deaf people existed and that on some level, though not always within my family, they mattered. They were also noticeably different, their speech garbled as if they were underwater, vowels flat and exaggerated, skittering around in their throats like marbles. Depressed and anxious, I needed something to hold on to during those years when I was uneasy in my own skin. The fantasy I carried during my first years of high school to become an actor, or maybe even a writer, seemed far-fetched for a boy who lacked confidence, who both craved attention and feared it. Teaching seemed a more practical choice. I was comfortable in the classroom with academics, if not in the social world of high school. During winter break of my senior year, I met a former high school classmate of my mother's who was the director of a program for deaf children in Lakewood on Cleveland's west side. She offered to let me visit her school, and so I took a day off to observe some elementary school classrooms. Watching those children, their fingers arcing through space, I felt a visceral pull and a sense that I'd found my calling. That pull was magnetic and not something I consciously connected with Jerry. Perhaps I was simply drawn to the difference exhibited by those deaf children and their exotic language, one I'd never seen Jerry use. See, Jerry's oral method teachers had forbidden him from signing. Becoming a teacher and learning to sign gave me a clear goal, something to hold on to during those years when I wanted the impossible, to feel an honest attraction to girls, to be normal, to fit in. I must have told Jerry about my plans when we gathered at Nanny and Papa's for Passover that spring, but we never had a chance to talk about it. I spent just a handful of hours with Jerry over the course of my childhood, and rarely one on one. The closest we came, when I was a small boy, Jerry would lift me up into the air, up toward the ceiling, and squeeze a bit too hard. Even then, I sensed that this was my uncle's way of conveying our connection, the only way he knew how. Soon after I turned 16, Jerry married Brenda while working as a draughtsman's assistant for a local architect, limited by the education he'd received from those same teachers who taught him to speak, but little else. Instead of learning about the world, Jerry spent thousands of hours in speech training, articulation, modulation, and lip reading. Many years later, after teaching at the Ohio School for the Deaf, using American Sign Language, I came to understand the price my uncle paid for his spotty education, for trying to be what he was not. In our otherness and isolation from the normal, Jerry and I were joined together in a silent pact. But in May of my senior year, shortly after I turned 18, Jerry died of a heart attack at 44. 2 months later, Papa fell off a ladder at his drugstore from an aortic aneurysm, or as I come to think of it later, a rending of the heart from the loss of his only son. Jerry died in 1975. Today, almost half a century later, I'm still trying to make meaning of our brief but profound connection, to figure out why he casts a shadow over my life and why I can't forget him. I have only fragments, tiny pieces to fill in the puzzle of who my uncle was beyond his deafness. And so he remains an enigma just beyond my grasp.